On a cold night in 1959, a blaze tore through the Negro Boys' Industrial School in Wrightsville, Arkansas. Inside that burning building were children, boys who should have been safe, protected, and guided. Instead, they were locked in a deteriorating dormitory. Windows barred, doors bolted, and not a single adult nearby to help them escape. By the time the fire was extinguished, 21 young lives had been lost. Their story was quickly overshadowed, buried beneath silence, discomfort, and a system that refused to take responsibility. Today, we revisit this tragedy not to reopen wounds, but to honor the boys whose voices were never heard. This story forces us to look at how vulnerable children were treated in institutions that claim to rehabilitate them. It reveals how neglect can be more devastating than any flame, and how entire communities were once expected to endure loss without justice. As we explore what happened that night and why it mattered, this video aims to give space to the names, faces, and futures that were stolen. It is a reminder that history is not only about events, but about people, and when we understand these stories, we become more aware, more empathetic, and more determined to build a better world. If this is the kind of history you believe deserves to be remembered and discussed, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring overlooked stories to light and ensures these voices are never forgotten again. In the days and months before the fire, the boys at Wrightsville lived under conditions that few adults could have endured, let alone children. Although the institution carried the name of a reform school, its daily reality bore almost no resemblance to rehabilitation or care. From the moment the sun rose, the boys were pushed into long hours of exhausting manual work, not as part of a structured program meant to teach responsibility or skills, but as unpaid labor that benefited the school and those who controlled it. Fields had to be cleared, crops tended, machinery moved, and chores completed with an intensity far beyond anything appropriate for their age. Many of these boys were no older than 12 or 13, yet their routines resembled the hardest kind of physical labor, carried out under strict supervision and constant pressure. Inside the facility, the atmosphere felt less like a place meant to guide troubled youths and more like a site designed to control them. Education existed mostly on paper, a requirement that looked respectable in reports but meant almost nothing in the daily lives of the children. Classrooms were understaffed or unused, materials were outdated, and lessons were rare interruptions rather than a meaningful part of their days. Instead of learning reading, math, or practical skills that could have helped them build a future, the boys were often left with the belief that their purpose was simply to work. Rehabilitation, growth, and support, the things parents thought they were sending their children to receive, were not priorities within those walls. As the boys moved through each day, they were shaped not by guidance but by a system that treated them as labor rather than young people who needed care. The harsh routines, the lack of proper schooling, and the constant physical demands created an environment that drained their spirit and dulled any hope for improvement. These children were not dangerous or violent. Many had been sent there for minor offenses, misunderstandings, or because their families had no other options. Yet the system responded to them with confinement and hard labor instead of compassion or structure. This reality made the tragedy of that 1959 night even heavier. When the fire broke out, the boys were not only trapped by locked doors and barred windows, they were also trapped by a system that had failed them long before the flames appeared. Their days of labor had exhausted them. Their lack of education had given them no tools to advocate for themselves, and the absence of responsible adults had placed them in constant danger. Every element of the institution contributed to their vulnerability, and every neglected duty increased the weight of what eventually happened. The story of the school's daily operations helps us understand the full picture of their lives. It shows how the fire was not a single tragic accident, but the final result of years of disregard. The environment they lived in was shaped by decisions that prioritized control over compassion, labor over learning, and silence over accountability. The boys carried the burden of that system every day, and their final hours were shaped by the same neglect that had defined their time there. Life inside the Negro Boys' Industrial School was grueling not only because of the relentless labor, but also because of the conditions in which the boys were forced to live. Conditions that would be unbearable for adults and catastrophic for children. The dormitories were overcrowded, rooms filled beyond capacity with bunk beds pressed tightly together, leaving barely enough space to move, much less to find a moment of privacy or rest. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the smell of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the stagnant dampness that seeped through cracked walls and broken windows. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, interrupted by the noise of creaking floorboards and the constant shuffling of dozens of boys packed into a space that could never have been designed to accommodate them safely. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Bathing facilities were limited and poorly maintained, forcing boys to wait in long, chaotic lines for access to the few showers available, many of which lacked hot water or proper drainage. Clothing, if provided at all, was often dirty, ill-fitting, or worn down from repeated use, offering no protection from the elements and little comfort for the body. Personal hygiene, so critical for growing children, was neglected, and the lack of basic cleanliness only intensified the spread of illness in such a confined environment. Even water, the most essential of necessities, was often undrinkable, tainted by rusting pipes or neglected storage, leaving the boys to suffer from thirst or risk sickness to quench it. Meals, when provided, were sparse and nutritionally insufficient, further weakening young bodies already taxed by relentless labor. In this environment, every day was a struggle to survive, and the boys had little hope that conditions would improve. The combination of overcrowding, poor sanitation, and inadequate care created a pressure cooker of stress and despair, one that shaped not only their physical health but also their emotional and psychological well-being. Loneliness, fear, and exhaustion became constant companions, and the institution's indifference to their suffering only deepened the sense of isolation. The boys had no voice to demand change, no adults to advocate for them, and no way to escape the unyielding cycle of neglect. This oppressive environment magnified the tragedy of the fire, showing how systemic neglect had already placed the boys in harm's way long before flames ignited. It was not only the barred windows and locked doors that trapped them. It was the cumulative effect of years of disregard for their basic human needs. The harsh living conditions, combined with the relentless labor and absence of education or guidance, created a situation in which disaster was not merely possible, it was almost inevitable. Understanding the daily reality of these boys' lives gives a fuller sense of the injustice they endured and the depth of the tragedy that struck Wrightsville that fateful night, emphasizing that their story is not just one of a single moment of catastrophe, but of prolonged neglect that made them tragically vulnerable. The Negro Boys' Industrial School in Wrightsville was not simply a product of neglect or poor planning. It was an institution deeply entwined with the systemic racial segregation and discriminatory policies that defined the American South in the mid-20th century. Every aspect of the school, from its design and staffing to the routines imposed on the boys, reflected a broader social order that treated black lives as inherently less valuable. While white reform schools across the region might have offered structured programs, adequate nutrition, and meaningful education, the Wrightsville facility provided none of these, signaling to its young residents from the outset that their lives and potential were considered expendable. The daily reality of the boys was shaped by a system that denied them the protections and resources routinely extended to their white counterparts. Dormitories were crumbling, facilities inadequate, and supervision sporadic, yet there was no urgency to improve the conditions because the boys were black. Teachers, caregivers, and administrators operated under a tacit assumption that these children were fundamentally unworthy of attention or investment, an assumption that permeated not only the institution itself, but the broader social and political environment in which it existed. Even basic human needs, nutritious food, clean water, and sanitary living quarters were treated as optional, and the consequences of deprivation were considered tolerable rather than alarming. Segregation was not merely a physical separation. It was an ideology enforced through policy, routine, and culture. Black children were systematically excluded from the opportunities afforded to white youths, whether in education, recreation, or health care, while white reform institutions could offer hope for rehabilitation or advancement. The Wrightsville school functioned as a mechanism of containment, a place where boys were isolated from society and denied the chance to develop skills, knowledge, or self-confidence. Work assignments were harsh and punitive rather than educational. Punishments were often cruel, and accountability for the boys' welfare was minimal. Every decision, from the choice of building materials to the frequency of medical inspections, carried an implicit message about the value, or lack thereof, placed on their lives. The institutional culture extended beyond physical neglect to the shaping of identity and self-perception. The boys were taught, implicitly and explicitly, that they were not entitled to the care, protection, or recognition that others received. This systemic denial of basic rights and dignity instilled fear, resignation, and a sense of invisibility, which compounded the physical hardships of their daily routines. Social isolation, coupled with harsh labor and unsafe living conditions, created a climate in which the children were constantly vulnerable, their safety contingent on little more than luck or the rare intervention of a sympathetic adult. This legacy of discrimination magnified the tragedy when the fire struck. The lethal combination of locked doors, barred windows, and inadequate safety measures was a direct consequence of the broader social order that treated black children as expendable. It was not merely a building that failed them, but a society whose policies and attitudes allowed neglect to persist unchecked. Understanding the racialized context of the institution illuminates why the fire was more than an accident. It was the culmination of systemic injustice, a stark reminder that the deprivation of resources, protection, and care is not a neutral act but one profoundly shaped by racial inequity. The story of Wrightsville, then, is a lens into a broader historical pattern, showing how policy, prejudice, and indifference can intersect to endanger the most vulnerable and silenced members of a community. For the survivors of the Negro Boys Industrial School in Wrightsville, the fire of 1959 was only the most visible tragedy of a much longer, more insidious ordeal. A single catastrophic event layered atop years of relentless suffering. Those who lived through the institution's daily routines spoke not only of the immediate fear and danger posed by locked dormitories and crumbling buildings, but also of the ongoing physical and emotional torment that marked nearly every aspect of their lives. There, former students recounted being subjected to beatings and punishments so severe that they left permanent scars, both on the body and in the mind, shaping their understanding of authority, trust, and personal worth for decades to come. Starvation and inadequate nourishment were routine, leaving children weak, ill, and constantly vulnerable to illness. Yet complaints were dismissed or punished, reinforcing a cruel cycle of neglect that communicated in no uncertain terms that their suffering was irrelevant. The trauma extended far beyond the immediate physical hardships. Many survivors described a pervasive atmosphere of fear and humiliation, where emotional abuse accompanied the physical, and where expressions of individuality or resistance were met with harsh reprimands. The lack of supervision and oversight meant that cruelty often went unchecked, creating a climate in which children learned to distrust adults who should have been their protectors. The absence of education, guidance, and opportunity compounded the damage, as boys who might have found purpose and stability through learning were instead funneled into exhausting labor and a system designed to minimize their potential. The psychological toll was profound, with memories of the dormitories, the harsh labor, and the constant threat of violence lingering long after they had left the campus, coloring their relationships, ambitions, and sense of self well into adulthood. Families, too, bore the weight of this systemic neglect. Parents and relatives who sent their children to the school in hopes of reform or protection were met with heartbreak and, often, disbelief when confronted with the conditions inside. The institution's official reports and communications masked the reality of abuse, making it difficult for families to advocate for their children or to understand the full extent of the harm being inflicted. The deaths and injuries from the fire were therefore not isolated tragedies. They were the culmination of years in which neglect and mistreatment had been normalized, leaving a generation of black boys physically weakened, psychologically scarred, and acutely aware of the precariousness of their existence in a society that often devalued their lives. Even decades later, the echoes of Wrightsville's brutality remain. Survivors recounted struggles with trust, self-esteem, and mental health, difficulties that were compounded by the broader social indifference to their suffering. The fire that claimed 21 lives became a symbol, not only of the dangers inherent in the facility itself, but of a systemic failure that allowed abuse to persist, unchallenged and often invisible to the outside world. Their testimonies reveal the full human cost of a system built on racial discrimination and institutional neglect, reminding us that the tragedy of Wrightsville was never simply a historical footnote, but a deeply human story of endurance, injustice, and the long shadow cast by the denial of care, safety, and dignity to those who most needed it. For years leading up to the catastrophic fire at the Negro Boys Industrial School in Wrightsville, a troubling pattern of neglect and indifference emerged from the very authorities entrusted with the safety of its students. A pattern that, in hindsight, reads as both preventable and tragically predictable. Repeated warnings and formal complaints had been submitted by staff, concerned citizens, and even visiting inspectors, highlighting an array of hazards that went unaddressed and dangerously unresolved. Reports documented rotting floorboards, cracked walls, malfunctioning electrical systems, and outdated heating equipment, all posing clear risks to the children housed within the deteriorating dormitories. Fire exits were obstructed or locked, and emergency protocols were either non-existent or ignored, leaving the institution ill-prepared to respond to the most basic of emergencies. Yet these warnings often met with minimal response. Vague assurances, or bureaucratic foot-dragging, a reflection of systemic apathy compounded by racialized indifference. Staff members at the school, many of whom had witnessed injuries, near misses, and escalating tensions, often felt powerless to effect change, frustrated by a chain of command that consistently placed administrative convenience over the well-being of the boys. Evidence later revealed that officials were acutely aware of the facility's understaffing, a chronic shortage that left children unsupervised for hours, forced staff into impossible workloads, and ensured that no one was present to adequately respond when danger arose. Maintenance requests languished for months or years, and critical repairs were postponed indefinitely under the guise of budgetary constraints. But the human cost of such delays was ignored. Inspections, when they occurred, were cursory, allowing obvious violations to remain uncorrected, and documentation of these deficiencies often vanished or was buried in bureaucratic archives. shielding those responsible from accountability. The systemic neglect extended beyond infrastructure into policies and oversight practices that devalued the lives of the students themselves. Institutional leaders, influenced by racial and social hierarchies of the time, treated black children as inherently expendable, discounting their vulnerability and the catastrophic consequences of inaction. Correspondence between officials shows a disturbing awareness of risk. They knew of fire hazards, structural weaknesses, and critical staff shortages, yet repeatedly deferred meaningful intervention, framing the issues as minor, manageable, or inevitable. This calculated inattention created an environment where a disaster was not merely possible, but almost inevitable. A reality that tragically manifested on that fateful day when flames engulfed the dormitory and claimed 21 young lives. In the aftermath, investigations uncovered a clear dissonance between public statements and internal knowledge. Officials publicly assured families and the community that the facility met safety standards, while internal memos, maintenance logs, and eyewitness accounts told a very different story. A facility left to crumble, a workforce stretched beyond capacity, and leadership unwilling or unable to prioritize the welfare of its charges. The fire, therefore, was not an isolated incident born of chance, but the culmination of years of systemic failures, deliberate oversight, and bureaucratic negligence. It stands as a stark reminder that institutional responsibility requires more than policy on paper. It demands vigilance, accountability, and, above all, a recognition of the intrinsic value of every human life under its care. Lessons that remain painfully relevant long after the ashes have cooled. In the chilling aftermath of the Wrightsville fire, as the smoke still hung heavy over the charred remains of the dormitory, and grieving families sought answers, the state moved quickly to craft a narrative that distanced itself from responsibility. A narrative that portrayed the tragedy as a sorrowful accident rather than the predictable outcome of systemic negligence. Public statements issued by officials were carefully worded, emphasizing the unpredictability of fire and the inevitability of such accidents, while internal documents and survivor testimonies painted a far different picture of long-standing warnings that had been ignored, safety protocols that were never implemented, and critical staffing shortages that left vulnerable children unprotected. Investigations were hurried, with timelines compressed and procedures truncated, giving the appearance of accountability while failing to probe deeply into the institutional failures that had made the disaster all but inevitable. Families of the victims quickly realized that the state's focus was not on truth or justice, but on shielding itself from scrutiny, hearing the same scripted reassurances repeated at press conferences. Parents and siblings understood that their children's suffering was being reframed as an unfortunate twist of fate, a tragedy without a culprit, rather than the culmination of years of systemic indifference and discriminatory policies. Legal avenues were pursued, but the state's defense leaned heavily on claims of compliance with regulations that, in reality, had been inadequately enforced, leaving structural decay, locked exits, and unsafe living conditions unchecked. Even when internal memos detailing fire hazards and emergency lapses were uncovered, officials dismissed them as routine documentation, suggesting that no actionable insights could have prevented the disaster. The rushed investigations also served to obscure the human stories behind the fire. Testimonies from survivors describing hours of unsupervised labor, harsh punishments, and the constant threat of injury were minimized or overlooked entirely, stripped from official records in favor of impersonal statistics and procedural accounts. In official reports, the fire became a narrative of chance rather than consequence, reducing 21 young lives to footnotes in a bureaucratic exercise designed to protect those in power. The focus on minimizing blame extended to the media, with state representatives carefully controlling access to the site, limiting interviews with staff, and issuing talking points that reinforced the notion of an unavoidable tragedy, effectively silencing voices that demanded recognition of systemic wrongdoing. Despite the state's attempts to rewrite the narrative, the community and surviving students persisted in seeking truth. Oral histories, personal letters, and later investigative journalism exposed the depth of neglect, showing that the fire was not a sudden catastrophe, but the predictable outcome of years of mismanagement and discriminatory practices. The tension between official denial and lived reality created a powerful dichotomy. On one hand, a state narrative that absolved itself of culpability, and on the other, a vivid record of human suffering and institutional failure that demanded acknowledgement. Over time, these conflicting narratives highlighted the dangers of a system more concerned with protecting its reputation than safeguarding lives, and underscored the enduring need for vigilance, accountability, and reform in institutions charged with the care of society's most vulnerable. The Wrightsville fire, in this light, stands not only as a story of tragic loss, but as a cautionary tale of how neglect and denial can compound human suffering. The state's choice to frame the disaster as unavoidable reinforced a dangerous precedent. When institutions prioritize self-preservation over the safety and dignity of those they serve, even predictable tragedies can be treated as accidents rather than preventable failures, leaving scars that echo across generations and demanding that society never forget the lessons written in fire and loss. The devastating fire at the Negro Boys Industrial School in Wrightsville is more than a historical tragedy. It is a stark reflection of the systemic racial injustice that permeated America's juvenile system for decades. While the flames that engulfed the dormitory claimed 21 young lives, they also illuminated a much larger pattern of dehumanization and neglect that countless black children faced across segregated institutions. These boys were not just victims of a fire. They were victims of a society that systematically denied them basic protections, treated them as expendable labor, and erased their humanity in the pursuit of a so-called reform. Their suffering is a mirror of a wider system in which racial bias dictated who received care and who was left to endure hardship, abuse, and preventable death. Beyond the immediate horrors of overcrowded dormitories, locked doors, and unsanitary conditions, the Wrightsville fire symbolizes the ongoing struggle against structural racism, a struggle that transcends generations. The way local authorities downplayed responsibility, rushed investigations, and reframed institutional negligence as mere accident demonstrates how entrenched biases allowed black lives to be undervalued and ignored. Families were denied justice, survivors were silenced, and the truth was suppressed, reinforcing a culture in which black children were perceived as lesser and expendable. By examining this event, we gain insight into the broader societal mechanisms that perpetuated inequality, highlighting the urgent need to confront historical injustices and ensure they are neither forgotten nor repeated. This tragedy also forces us to recognize the resilience of those who survived and those who fought for accountability. Their stories, filled with courage, endurance, and the pursuit of truth, challenge the narratives that sought to erase their suffering. They remind us that historical memory is not merely a record of the past, it is a responsibility to acknowledge the wrongs committed and to advocate for a future where institutions uphold justice, dignity, and humanity for all children, regardless of race. By remembering Wrightsville, we honor the lives lost and the voices silenced, using their stories as a call to action for reform and equity in the systems designed to protect the most vulnerable. As we reflect on the Wrightsville fire, let it serve not only as a memorial to those 21 boys, but also as a lesson for all of us. The consequences of indifference and systemic bias are profound and far-reaching. Education, awareness, and advocacy are crucial in ensuring that no child is ever again trapped by neglect, prejudice, or a system that fails to see their worth. We owe it to the victims, to their families, and to future generations to confront uncomfortable truths, to demand accountability, and to build institutions that truly protect and nurture every child. Thank you for taking the time to witness this story with me today. If this account moved you or opened your eyes to a chapter of history that cannot be forgotten, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. By supporting this work, you help ensure that stories like those of Wrightsville are told, remembered, and used as catalysts for change. Together, we can honor the past, advocate for justice, and shape a future where every child is valued, protected, and given the chance to thrive.